So we'd like to welcome you to today's event on evaluating the effectiveness of occupational safety and health training delivered in a distance learning format. What are the critical factors for success? And with that, I'm excited to hand it over to our panelists. I'm joined today by Gary Gustafson, the director of CPWR's Environmental Hazards Training Program, and Suann Sarpy from Sarpy and Associates, who are going to give us some more information about these critical factors for success and how they found them. Gary, I will hand it over to you to get us started. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jess, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're excited for you to join us today. And I just want to do two things before we get started. And first is I want to sort of lay the foundation of why we're here today talking about this evaluation. So in the beginning, as many with the pandemic, the move to distance learning format happened broadly across the United States and actually across the world. And we were at part of that as well at CPWR. And we looked at some questions when we moved over to the distance learning format, because we originally had started with some short courses that CPWR was conducting during the pandemic, actually both virtually and in person, because if you recall in the beginning of the pandemic, construction in many states was considered a critical function. And so construction workers were still going to work, and many of our training centers, our unionized joint apprenticeship training centers across the country, were providing in-person training. So we had the opportunity to engage with Dr. Sarpy on our first study, which was looking at the effectiveness of distance learning as it applied to these short courses that CPWR was providing, both in person and virtually, or in a distance learning format. And I'd like to call it distance learning, because virtual is kind of gets a little bit of a language quagmire, but we're going to call it distance learning. And so what we did is that first evaluation, and I know at some point today in the chat box, Jess or Miles will put the link up on where you can find the first evaluation and the sort of the lessons learned documents that we developed from there. Well, what also happened after the distance learning of the short courses started, the movement over to distance learning in longer courses happened. And so we at CPWR started asking the same questions. What's the effect of distance learning on longer courses? These were multi-day courses. So what we did is we once again engaged with Dr. Sarpy, and we wanted to answer, sort of to ask the same questions. What's the effectiveness of distance learning on longer courses? So today you get to witness the evaluation results on just that question. So that's where this evaluation is going to look at the longer courses provided in the distance learning format. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our main panelist today, Dr. Suann Sarpy. Dr. Sarpy is the founder of Sarpy and Associates, and she is an industrial organizational psychologist with over 20 years of experience in a variety of academic and applied settings. Dr. Sarpy has served as principal scientist and lead evaluator on several interdisciplinary teams examining effectiveness and impact of various organizational interventions, including leadership and effective development, emergency preparedness and response, worker resiliency, occupational health and safety, and community citizen science training. She has written a series of articles, book chapters, and technical reports on these efforts. Her areas of expertise include employee selection, training and development, performance assessment and management systems, social network analysis, and organizational effectiveness. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Suann Sarpy. Suann, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm just gonna let Jess know that for some reason I can't advance the slide. There we go. Okay, success. So as Gary said, I'm just There we go. Okay. As Gary said, this study really came about from a previous study we had done with the CPWR, where we were looking at the shorter courses. And as Gary explained, this was done very early on in the pandemic. It was when there was this rapid transition from the face-to-face format that most folks are fairly comfortable with respect to worker health and safety training, into a very rapid shift to the online training to provide some of the necessary safety courses. And we did a rapid study where we looked at the distance learning versus the in-person. And to be really clear, I'm even going to clarify what Gary made narrower. With the distance learning, with respect to these studies, we really are talking about, when we talk about distance learning, we're talking about synchronous learning, just as we're doing right now if you're live in person with me. It tends to be more interactive, it's synchronous format. And what we found was when they were using that, primarily Zoom, and they were engaging in these highly interactive techniques, we found that the results of the evaluation showed for those short courses that, in fact, distance learning, provided they were following certain best practices, which we put together a guide which shows on the screen, it was quite effective when compared with the face-to-face that most people were a little more familiar with. So as we moved through the pandemic, and as Gary said, more courses were getting transitioned to the distance format, some of the questions that emerged was, Gary's like, how will this look for the longer courses? Will these best practices hold? And I said, that's such an excellent question. So we went back in using much the same evaluations and techniques that we had used to evaluate the shorter courses with the longer courses. So the trainings were of a longer duration. And in this case, because more folks were now entering into the distance learning realm with worker health and safety training, there were various providers providing the training. So we were looking across various training providers. And then in the first study, we had really looked at subjective measures. We looked at people's self-reports. And what we wanted to do was then broaden that as well and say, if we look at more objective measures, are we still seeing the same result? And so that's what we're going to be going through today with that second evaluation. And again, as I said, that was given, we were a little bit further along with the pandemic, and we were focusing on two courses. One was the OSHA 510, and the other was the OSHA 500. They were provided in person pre-pandemic and traditional face-to-face format. They were modified to distance during the pandemic, delivered by various training providers. And we looked at the dates November 2018 to June of 2021. Just to let you know, most of you are familiar with the OSHA 510 and OSHA 500 courses, but this just gives you a brief overview of them. But what I want to focus on, when I say the courses were longer, what we were looking at, the minimum student contact hours were 26 hours or more. So our first study really dealt with two trainings that were, one was 1 hour and one was 6 hour, and now we've moved into the courses of longer duration. So which is more effective? Well, we looked at effectiveness in a couple of different ways, but in our first study, what we focused on were the immediate measures of effectiveness, and that was measured through the CPWR evaluations. The CPWR has training evaluations. They give it on all their courses. They're given immediately following the course. It's 26 items, their self-report. They look at effectiveness in two ways, instructor effectiveness and the training methods effectiveness. But then they also look at self-reported learning. They have sort of a generic safety competencies of 8 items that are quite good, and they measure those immediately following all their trainings. As I said, we also included standardized measures. So we looked at the OSHA testing. Both the OSHA 510 and the OSHA 500 have standard tests that accompany those, and again, given immediately following training. The reason I showed this slide is just to show you many of these trainings, these evaluation studies, when they're looking at face-to-face versus distance, have very small numbers. And what we did was we expanded the timeline long enough that we felt like we wanted to have a large enough sample that we could have robust findings that we would feel confident about, our results. And what you see here is we have, in the case of OSHA 500, 280, but essentially 300 or more in each of the conditions. What you'll notice on all these slides that I'm presenting, the face-to-face is going to be in the yellow, the gold. I sort of did that because face-to-face tends to be the gold standard, and the distance is going to be represented by the green. So when we looked at ratings of effectiveness, what we found was, and as you look at this slide, and I'll give you a second to orient again, the face-to-face is in yellow and the distance is in green. What you'll see is right off the bat, when you look at effectiveness, and this is instructor effectiveness and effectiveness reported about, this is from the trainee's perspective, reported on the methods, what you'll see is both face-to-face and online in both of the courses received quite high ratings in terms of the trainees' impressions of effectiveness. What you will see is that they were significantly higher for the face-to-face, but when you take a look at those numbers, and it's on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being least effective, 5 being most effective, what you see right off the bat is all these numbers are quite high. So they're rating the instructor and the methods quite high, both in terms of the face-to-face and the distance, but the face-to-face still has a slight edge when you look at ratings of instructor effectiveness. And this is really important, and we'll talk a lot about this as I talk through this, is that the instructors really are the key drivers of success for these training formats, both in person and distance. So the ratings of instructor effectiveness are quite important, but I don't want to overinterpret this graph. These ratings on both face-to-face and distance are quite high. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. So what about the more objective measure? What about the testing? This gives you, and again, I'll let you orient a second, the face-to-face in gold, the distance in green. This gives you a sense of how did they come out in terms of the objective measures of learning. And what we see is the red line here represents passing score. Okay, it's a little different for the 510 and the 500, but in essence, the red line tells you the cut score of what they needed to pass. And what you see immediately when you look at the slide is they're all performing quite well. It's not that any one format shows a high rate of failure. It's not. Those are a score of up to 100%. And what you'll see is in all the cases, you're seeing a predominant of passing scores. What you do notice with the OSHA 500 is there still seems to be a slight edge when you look at the face-to-face versus the distance. It says it's significantly different in that OSHA 510, but that really is very small, what we call effect sizes. That effect is very small, but we do see for the OSHA 500 that the face-to-face seems to have a slight edge over the distance. So what we wanted to do was get a greater understanding of why that is. When we look at overall in terms of the evaluation measures, what we see is both demonstrated high ratings of effectiveness. The face-to-face received significantly higher ratings of instructor effectiveness, and the face-to-face seemed to outproduce with the learning. So why do you think we're getting that? So we delved in a little more closely with the distance to take a look at that. And what I did was I met with the training providers there were 13 training providers in that previous sample, and I met with 10 of them with the training coordinators of those training centers, and many of them brought their master instructors in. And I just wanted to get a good feel of, were there differences were there certain areas of strengths or weaknesses among the way the distance learning was being designed and delivered. And what I found rather quickly was there was a lot of consistency. When you saw these training providers, they were creating or trying to create that same highly interactive, engaging format that they used in their face-to-face trainings in their distance learning training. So that's why they all were using Zoom. Some of them also used WebEx or Teams to a slight extent, but not for these courses. But across the board, they were using Zoom. And when I said, why Zoom? One was the familiarity with Zoom. Another was Zoom allowed them to be highly interactive. So what we also noticed was they had multiple instructors, and typically they had one instructor that was assigned to deal with the technical difficulties. Just like when I was calling out for Jess, I can't move the slides. They had one instructor that was a part of the team that when the other instructor was instructing, they were taking care of those technological glitches. They all did orientation training, not only for the students or the trainees coming in to take the courses, but also for the instructors, just to make sure ahead of the courses, everyone took that in orientation training so that everybody was sort of at the same level of skill before they started the class. They also, as I said, were highly interactive. And one of the things that they spoke about was many of them used small group exercises in their face-to-face. They were using those breakout rooms to mimic that, mimic that in the online setting. So those breakout rooms, that high level of interaction, allowed them to maintain that level of engagement. The other thing they also did for that standardized testing, CPWR had given them some guidelines on how to do that in a way that they could proctor the students. And they were all using that structured testing format where they had the cameras on while they were completing those tests, and proctors monitoring them. And they were all using that format. So that was consistent. So we knew what they were doing sort of similarly. What were they doing different? Where I saw differences was the scheduling. And there were some differences that varied amongst them, but here's the 4 major components of it. They either gave them a lunch during that 26 hours or they didn't. The length of training before breaks, they were either longer, 2 to 2.5 hours versus 1 hour. The lengths of the break they gave them were either short, 10 to 15 minutes or 45 minutes. And they gave the training either over consecutive days, or they gave a day or two and then had a weekend break to give them a break and then re-engaged the following week. The philosophy was sort of the same in their thinking. They just handled it a little different. The idea was they're looking at a computer just as we're doing right now, and they wanted to make sure we're keeping them engaged. So one philosophy was we're going to give them shorter trainings, more breaks, no lunch, and we're just going to keep it short and to the point all the way through. And they did that over consecutive days. To the other end of the spectrum, which was the longest training session, where we're going to keep them in blocks of about 2.5 hours with a 45-minute break, 30-minute break, and another long block. And then we're going to break it up over the weekend. And the thinking there was we're going to give them a lot of information, then give them a break to use their phones, take a bathroom break, eat lunch, etc. And that's the way we're going to keep them engaged. The two in the middle, we didn't get as clear-cut a result. So what I'm really focusing on is, do you give your trainings shorter sessions with shorter breaks over consecutive days, or do you do one larger session with a larger break with a weekend break? And here's what we found. There were significant differences. And what we saw, both for the 510 and for the 500, these are preliminary findings. I would love to see this conducted again, and I'd love to hear if others have done this to hear what their results are. But preliminary, here's what we found. What you'll see very starkly in both, again, people are passing. It's not like we're seeing a high failure rate in any of the conditions. But what we see is those shorter spurts of training with those shorter breaks tend to fare the least well in terms of their testing, their performance on the test. The students, the trainees that tended to fare better were those that had those longer sessions with those longer breaks that was given not consecutively, but with a weekend break. So what we find is we do have, there wasn't a lot of evidence that either schedule highly impacted their ratings of effectiveness. But what we did find, as I said, that longest schedule tends to have the highest learning gains in terms of standardized testing. So it gives us some preliminary information that scheduling does in fact matter when we're looking at the learning gains. Okay, so that's the first thing we found. The second thing we wanted to do was, okay, that was immediate learning gains, but how does this hold over time? And this is something that, we all kind of strive to do in terms of getting measures of performance back on the job or longer term maintenance of learning. And we were able to do this, but we focused this time really on the distance courses. And so what we did was I worked with CPWR, and we came up with a 46-item survey. I always gather, if you know me, I gather quantitative and qualitative items. And we looked at it from 2 viewpoints, both that of the trainees and of the trainers. And we looked again at key elements of instructor, content, format, overall effectiveness. And then we also use those same 8 items, those knowledge items that CPWR used, because I really like that scale, or those items that they used, and we used it on a different scale. The scale before, the CPWR scale before, was 1 to 5. On this one, we had them rate on 1 to 7. And I did that purposely because we were getting measures also of performance, and I wanted to make sure we had enough variance to see changes in behavior if it did occur. And then we also looked at some climate-related items, support on the job. One of the first things I'm asked when I talk about this is, did trade affiliation, is what kind of work they're doing have an impact on this? So one of the first things we did was we had 10 trades represented in the sample, and we looked to see if there were any differences in that maintenance of learning and performance with respect to distance. And what we found was trade affiliation had no bearings at all on any of those learning outcomes on the 3 to 6 months post measure. But what we did find, and we found this also for the shorter courses, was technological competence did matter. And when I say technological competence, the way we measure it is looked at 2 ways. One is, how skilled are you in the technology? Are you very facile on Zoom? Are you really comfortable on WebEx? Do you know how to launch slides and answer and put people in breakout sessions? Are you comfortable doing those things? That's skill. The other, when we talk about comfort, we're really talking about their preference in receiving the training. Do you really like this distance learning environment? They're very related, but they're distinctly different. And those are both go into what we consider technological competence. And we've measured this a couple of times, and we do in fact find that the ratings are correlated, but they are measuring qualitatively different constructs. When I talked with the training providers, one of the things they asked me was, Sue-Ann, we really think people have gotten more comfortable with this technology, but we're not sure. Are you looking at that? And I said, yes, I am. So I want to present this back to you because I know a lot of people have this question in mind. What we see is when we ask people, and I'm focusing on comfort because that was the main variable that impacted the training outcomes. But when I ask folks, has your comfort with the distance learning training changed during the pandemic? And we had them rated on a scale from greatly improved to greatly decreased. What we see is, yes, in fact, just as you all have suspected, more than almost 3/4 of them, certainly more than half, have said they've either improved or greatly improved their comfort with the technology during the pandemic, mainly because we were all forced to use it, but they said, yes, in fact, the comfort did increase. Where did that land though? Just because they've improved, where did they end up with? And what you'll see is the great majority of folks said, yes, at this point during the pandemic, and be aware this study this information was gathered about a year ago. So as of that point within the pandemic, and I believe this is August of 2020, about approximately a year ago, what we see is the vast majority of folks are either comfortable or very comfortable with the technology. But you do have some stragglers, some to the point of rating themselves very uncomfortable, that do exist. And this is not right out of the chute when we were first using this technology. This is, we're pretty far in now. So what does that mean? 3 to 6 later, how does this influence the ratings? Now, we've got a report that goes with this that discusses this in great detail, but we don't have time here. But what I will tell you is what you see is, and the way this goes is, the green line are the folks that rate themselves very comfortable. The yellow line are the folks that rate themselves comfortable. So this is still a high level of comfort. And the red group, we combine the neutral and somewhat comfortable. And what you'll see rather quickly, and most of these are highly significant, is their level of comfort does impact their training outcomes. And this is training outcomes 3 to 6 months post. So what you're seeing is the more comfortable with the technology, the greater the training outcomes you're seeing with them. And if you look at learning, performance, supervisory support, you're looking at those kinds of items where we traditionally see as the level 2, level 3 items, if you think of Kirkpatrick's framework. So this is meaningful. And what this signals to us is we need to be mindful of their level of comfort with the technology. We all tend to focus on their skill with technology, but you also need to be assessing, particularly in those orientations, their level of comfort with the technology, because what we found is, when we looked at these items with skill with the technology, we did not see this kind of significance going. So what we see is their comfort with the technology needs to be taken into account. And for those folks that are less comfortable, they may need a little more student support and a little more technological support to drive those numbers up, because it is impacting the training outcomes. Okay. The last thing that I want to talk about is the continued use of distance learning moving forward. When we first conducted our very first study back when the pandemic first started, there was so much uncertainty going, is this distance learning something that, we're just using right now that we may not use moving forward? Then as the waves of the pandemic kept going, this is why many of the courses have transitioned to distance learning. It was part of people's continuity plans of keeping the workers, giving them safety information, but keeping them safe during the pandemic. So there was this continued use. And one of the questions that has been posed to me is this something that folks are now, where initially folks said, the minute the pandemic ends, we're running, we don't want to do this anymore. We're going to go right back to face-to-face. Is this something, has that changed? Is this something now, as we've become more facile with the technology, as we become more comfortable and accustomed with the technology, is this something that folks desire moving forward? So one of the measures that you can use to discern that is your Net Promoter Score. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Net Promoter Score. It has since taken off. When I first was introduced to this, and this was when I was doing some evaluation early in the pandemic, I was taking some coursework at UVA's business school, and they suggested, hey, take a look at this. Now it is since sort of, if you look at Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or many of the survey engines, they have this score that many folks gather, but there's a reason for that. And Net Promoter Score really, in the case of distance learning, is looking at learner experience. But a Net Promoter Score is used to look at your customer loyalty or your customer experience with any product or service. So in the pandemic, when folks and organizations were changing rapidly their products and services to meet the needs of the customers that were changing and emerging during the pandemic, folks started using these Net Promoter Scores. And what does it tell us? It's a very simple metric in which you ask folks, how likely are you to recommend this product or service? So when we're looking at the use of distance learning in the new foray of it in terms of occupational safety and health training that's traditionally in a face-to-face format, it gives you an idea of what is the trainee's experience and how likely are they to continue to use this or to recommend its use. And there's three main categories when you have them rate this, and you have them rated on a scale of 1 to 10. The first group is what we call the promoters, and that's the group of people that are very enthusiastic supporters. They give it ratings of 9 or 10, and they're the folks who pretty much got on board with the technology. The passives are the folks that rate it 7 or 8. They can be sort of swayed one way or another. They're there, but they're not 100% there. The detractors are folks that are not on board, and they're the folks that are most likely not going to want to use the technology, and they tend to, or whatever the product or service is, in our case, it's distance learning, and they give it the rate of 0 to 6. How do you derive this Net Promoter Score? You take the percentages of people that are really on board to promoting it, which is 9 or 10, and you subtract from it the percentage of people that are rating it the 0 to 6. And in that way, if 100% of people are on board and giving it 9 or 10, it'd be 100% minus 0% detractors, so you'd be a score of 100, versus if a lot of people are not on board, they'll be rating it that 0 to 6, it'd be 100% detractors, so it'd be 0% promoters minus 100% detractors, and you get your negative 100. What do these scores tell us? Well, typically you've got benchmarks in industry, but when I was looking at this, what I realized is Net Promoter Score is not often used in occupational health and safety training, but so I'm using a more absolute scale. But as more of us use this, we will be able to create benchmarks with this. But in an absolute term, excellent, where you've got a lot of people on board and you're doing well with your product service, would be 71 to 100%. Great would be 31 to 70, good 1 to 30, and where you're kind of getting that red zone where you need to keep a mindful eye of what's going on, that's the negative 100, 0 to negative 100. So when we ask the folks in our sample, and this was about 100 of the trainees, would you recommend the distance learning training for future 510 and 500 courses? This is what we saw. The Net Promoter Scores were 33 for the 510 and 36 for the 500. And those scores can be a little abstract. So what I wanted to do was create this visual for you so that you can see that when you get a score of 33, what that means is it's a positive score. And what it means is you have more of your folks in the green than you do in the red. And if you look back on this previous slide, well, what is a 33? That's in the good range, excuse me, in the great range. What I will tell you is a 33 and a 36 on something that you've just transitioned is quite a strong score, because this isn't, if I gave the same question to the face-to-face training, I would bet my lunch money that the scores would be much higher, but those are trainings that you refined over time. When you've transitioned to a new format and you get scores this high, you can rest assured that you've done a product that has support in it. But remember how I said instructor effectiveness was so imperative in these courses. I also wanted to use it a little bit differently from what's traditionally used with the customers or the trainees, and also use it with the instructors, because the instructors are the key drivers of success for these programs. And what you'll see is a very different picture. When you look at the net promoter scores for instructors and you ask them, would you recommend teaching this course again in this format? What you'll see is you have more detractors than you do promoters. So what you see here is there's some inconsistency. Your customer base, your trainees are giving you quite good scores, but the instructors are signaling, there's issues that they see in the training. Scores are just scores. A metric is just a metric. The why behind it is so terribly important. And so what we did with those qualitative comments is we went back in, and this is typical what you'll see when you get an NPS score that's on the lower side, such as with the instructors. When you look at why did you give it this, and you look at the strengths and weaknesses, they list more weaknesses. And what the things that are in yellow, this is consistent with what we saw for strengths and weaknesses when we were looking at this with the shorter courses. What emerged in yellow, and I would say this is partly because it's further along in the phase of the pandemic and the use of distance learning, is they started talking about the convenience and the efficiency. It wasn't just the safety during COVID, it's also they could see that there were benefits both from the trainee side and from the trainer side in terms of convenience and efficiency. And as I said, those breakout rooms, both the trainees and the instructors were saying those were terribly important for that. The weaknesses, and these are things to really think about as you design and deliver your training, that they tended to focus on tended to be a lot of the more interaction, social type issues, where they felt like the level of interaction, even though they were kind of maxing it out with the breakout room, lacked what they had with the face-to-face. And I think many of us feel this way. We were talking before we came online about, I'm getting ready to go to my first in-person conference in quite a while, and the experience is just quite different in terms of face-to-face versus online. And that's what they were conveying to us, those relational, more intangibles, they felt were impacting it. And they felt like it was harder to read the room. It was harder to really gauge their level of engagement and their level of understanding. And so they said some of those limitations were still there, and they were still working on that, but they felt like those were barriers in terms of using the distance learning. So I just want to alert you to the fact that even though you see that high NPS score with the trainees, what you'll see is that the instructors actually told you, they can identify these issues, and they are actively, and the programs are working on these as we speak. So where does that leave us? Well, my bias toward this has been, even in the early stages of the pandemic, I think we really do need to, when we're talking about these trainings in the future, we really do need to think about those issues, that the weaknesses that the instructors were talking about with respect to that social interaction and social support. I think particularly for those folks that are that have that level of issue with a level of comfort with the technology, we don't want to leave those folks behind as we broaden our use of distance learning. So I think it's important for us to start measuring that and evaluating that as we look at these programs and keep a keen eye on that. The other thing I think is to keep expanding. We are learning more and more about the trainee and the training characteristics. That we looked at scheduling in our study, and we looked at the level of comfort and technological competence. But I think as we grow this evidence base and conduct more research, we'll have a more fine-tuned understanding of that. The evidence base is very large with respect to these issues in the higher ed and to some extent in the medical training. But I think this population is unique, and I think there's still a lot to be learned and a lot to share with respect to the trainer and the training characteristics. The other thing when we think about that is the integration of the face-to-face with the distance learning. I think initially it was that, a rapid push with the reactionary to the pandemic, but now as we move through that and as the pandemic seems to be more and more abated and we're going to more of these face-to-face formats, we've learned an awful lot, and it's really now strategically thinking about how to integrate that information that we've learned into these hybrid formats and these flipped classrooms so that we don't lose what we've learned as we move forward. The other thing is I make a plug for Net Promoter Scores. It would really be interesting to be able to benchmark. I have some colleagues who I presented this at another session. I have colleagues who are now gathering this information, and I think because we don't have NPS scores in occupational health and safety training that I've been able to find, I think it really would be helpful for us to start gathering that and sharing that information so that we can benchmark with each other as we move different courses and different types of courses in different configurations with the online. And then the final thing I just wanted to say was with respect to, this is the first 2 studies of this, but we are hoping to continue looking at this, looking at additional safety trainings. The information that holds for this, what we saw was there was an awful lot of overlap between the shorter courses and the 30-hour, but it will be interesting to see if there are more differences or more similarities as we move into the longer courses, such as the 40 hours. And then finally, I just want to say I'm presenting this study, but this was really a collaborative effort with my colleagues in Wisconsin, as well as Gary Gustafson, Steve Surtees, and Mike Hasman from CPWR. And the other thing that I'd like to say is the NAP2 affiliates were unbelievably generous in terms of their time and sitting and having those engaging interviews with me and sharing information. And I just wanted to give a shout out to them as well. And then also this research wouldn't have been possible without the support of NIEHS. I ran through this rather quickly. There's the long version of this report with much more of the detailed information in it is available online, and the link is here. And with that, I open the floor to questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Sarpy. We got a couple questions during the presentation, and then everyone should feel free to enter questions now. I'm going to start with some of the ones that we got during registration. And the first question I have is, when doing distance learning, is it important that your shorts match your shirt for the Zoom session?
Okay, I think that was meant as a joke, but I think the most important thing I would say, and Gary, I want your input on this too. I would say that I saw in the results that when we were compiling some of the best practices is when you're doing distance learning, you're sort of bringing the world into your home. And so, the way that you have to be careful of the background behind you, what you're presenting forward, everyone is seeing when the mic's on. And in most of these courses, because they're synchronous, they have them leave the camera and the mic's open the entire time, and they tell them, what you're saying, we're hearing what we see on screen, everybody's brought into your home. So I think both from the instructor side and from the student side, I know we meant that as a joke, but I think that can be actually pretty important.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Sue. And I think, what we've learned both from both evaluation studies is just that the invitation, using distance learning was the invitation into a person's private space, because they were typically at home or in their private office, and that becomes important to recognize, both, as you said, from the trainer, but also from the trainee's perspective, because sometimes we experience in breakout sessions that trainees will talk, and they might talk as if they talked on the job site, and not recognizing that next to one person might be their child, or somebody that's not in the class, but they're in the general vicinity of the person. And so those were some of the lessons learned that we were able to derive from both the first study and then I think confirmed in this second study. So though, yes, thank you for the question. We got a good laugh, but it's an important part of what we've learned.
Great. Next question is, what's the best way to deliver distance learning for a worker who has limited computer skills? Sue-Ann, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think the most important part of that really is when I was talking, and the students, well, the trainees talked about it, I call them students, but the trainees talked about it and the instructors talked about it, was the idea of those orientation sessions were important to them for a couple of reasons. One is it made sure that everybody had all the information they needed ahead of time. They came to them, they were mandatory, and they came to them and they made sure everybody had all the necessary information. But it worked through a lot of those connectivity issues. And the instructors were saying, for them, it's sort of practice makes perfect, where they would practice and practice and practice using the technology before they actually got into the virtual classrooms or the distance learning classrooms. It's sort of the same thing for us when we're taking courses, is that the more that we are familiar with practicing, even if it's a 2-hour orientation session with raising your hand and seeing where the chat is, it doesn't mean that it's not going to, that you're not going to have issues on site, but it allows you to make those mistakes and know that that's okay and that you're not going to crash, the whole classroom, those kind of things. The instructors are quite facile, I think, in making an environment, or the way it was conveyed to me, it's okay to make a mistake. You're not going to hit the wrong button, and they try to really convey that to folks that aren't as comfortable with it, so that it doesn't become as much of an impediment. But I think that from what I was seeing in the results, I think what's most key to that are those mandatory orientation for both students and instructors.
Yeah, I agree, Sue-Ann. Early on, there were, I guess, anticipation that students or learners, trainees, whatever, thought that they could attend some sessions using their smartphone, only to find out very quickly that features of distance learning weren't effective on a smartphone or even on a tablet. And so those mandatory orientation sessions quickly identified those limitations from the learner's side, the student side, and adjustments could be made before the actual class began. So the student could go find a different device or try to make arrangements to be on a computer, which that too can be challenging. I mean, one thing we don't necessarily talk about explicitly in the study is obviously the technology limitations of low bandwidth, and those are ubiquitous regardless of this study or whatever type of training. But what we were able to sort of learn, from the student and also the instructors, you have to be comfortable with the technology. The orientation sessions did just that, or it identified where you weren't comfortable and then allowed the student to make the determination to not take the class at this time because they knew that their comfort wasn't going to allow them to be successful.
Right. This sort of leads into our next question, which is, were results compared by age group? Because, presumably there would be some differences in ability between, Generation Z and some of the older generations. So was that a factor in your evaluation?
That's such a great question. We did not look at the data in that way, and we purposefully didn't for this reason. At first, we thought, well, really age is sort of an indicator, because what we find, like, my daughter can do anything on a computer, whereas, I can write program language, but I'm not that facile on some of the ins and outs of how to use these type of formats. And what we found was age. We were sort of using age as a proxy. So what we decided was just to more directly measure, have them just simply ask them, do you feel skilled in, do you feel comfortable in using the technology? We did not gather information on age for that reason, because we more directly asked that question. So I don't know the answer to it. My suspicion is probably that, perhaps it's easier for some of the younger folks, but I will say right off the bat, the instructor cohort with the COVID courses that I did for the first evaluation, they were not a group that was a younger group of instructors, and they were very eager to learn Zoom and how to do the distance learning technology, and were learning all sorts of different tricks and tools and tips that we were able to integrate in some of those best practices. And it was really had no correlation at all with age. So I think there is that sort of thinking out there, but I think many of us sort of dispel that myth. I'd like to see what your thoughts are on that, Garrett, because we didn't measure it directly.
No, because we didn't measure it, I don't have anything more to add on that, but it would be I do remember, Swan, in the initial survey, we had a large population of apprentices take training, and one would assume apprentices would be younger, but yet our findings still showed that comfort with the technology was crucial to success in the training. So I'm not necessarily, it would be interested to delve into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it's a great question.
And follow up to that, we had a question that asks if there are plans to conduct this same study outside of the OSHA 500, 510, maybe with a population of learners representing line level production occupations.
So the answer is our first study dealt more with line level workers. They were either apprentices or journey workers, working at the tools. So we felt that, the findings in that first study, which, as Dr. Sarpy already mentioned, correlate to a lot of what we found in this second evaluation. So we did see some interaction with line level workers, but that's looking at a study just devoted to workers at that aren't quote unquote supervisors or OSHA level 500 level instructors would be something to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, what is the best way to administer virtual learning as far as it being instructor-led versus self-paced, where instructor-led may mean less frequent learning versus self-paced being more frequent?
Well, I'll start by saying our evaluation only looked at instructor-led. We did not do any asynchronous learning. So what we looked at was everything was, and it was purposely that way. That's our training philosophy at CPWR, and the affiliates that helped us with this was that the training was best done with instructor-led. So in that regard, what we looked at is, what Sue-Ann's results show you is using instructor-led. Then we fine-tuned, we fine-tuned the various what works, what are the best practices, going back to scheduling and comfort and preparation. So don't know if we can fully answer that question because we're not looking at the asynchronous learning environment in this evaluation.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Gary. I think it's really important when you look at these results to really think about that, is the fact that this really is with a highly interactive, that peer-led, synchronous type training. And that's really what these results speak to. I know there's a large body of research with college students and things of that nature where they do look at more of the asynchronous learning, and there's a huge body of results for that, evidence base for that. But this really, when we talk about our results, we really are talking about those highly engaging synchronous formats.
Okay. When you talked about effectiveness at the beginning, are the students actually being asked about satisfaction with the course and the instructor?
They're being asked, how, I'd have to look at the exact wording, but they're doing ratings of how effective they find with different aspects of the instructor. So for example, with their covering of the learning objectives, with their ability to provide feedback to the students, and they're rating those levels of effectiveness in that way. The ratings for the method, that separate section that was looking at method and materials, are more just rating of that particular method. So whether it was that the handouts that they gave or things of that nature, but the instructor effectiveness are really looking at, they more map onto the adult learning format. Are the instructors following those principles? And that's similarly what we measured in the 3 to 6 months out as well.
Mhm.
With distance learning, what would you say are the top key characteristics trainers should use to their advantage during facilitation online to help engage students?
Can I answer that one first, Sue Ann?
Yes.
So it goes back to what Sue Ann already talked. It's the interaction. It's the same tool set an instructor uses in the face-to-face. They just have to think how to retool those skills to the distance learning, because as I've seen in the past, there are good face-to-face learning environments, and then there are poor face-to-face learning environments, and that same translation happens in the distance learning. I've seen very effective distance learning environments, and I've seen very poor distance learning environments, and it really comes down to the tool set that instructor brings to the environment. To answer the question, it really is, the instructor refining those tool sets in the particular methodology that they're using. So if they're good face-to-face trainers or instructors, and they use high participatory activities, find a way in the distance learning format to do the same thing, because I think what we're seeing is the same results happen. Students, the learners, when I talk about students or learners or trainees, that's all the same group of people on one side of the discussion. You have instructors and trainers, and you have students, learners, and trainees. I think, Sue Ann, you're the same way. We tend to use those interchangeably with, and then trainers and instructors on the other side. But using those same tool sets from the trainer instructors to the trainee students, or learners on the other side, is going to make it, successful. If you don't have that right tool set, then regardless if you're going to be face-to-face or distance learning, it's not going to be an effective presentation.
Yeah. It's something, and I smile because I was talking about this with Gary yesterday. It's really the same principles that have made these courses so strong in the face-to-face format. It's not that there's some magical element with face-to-face or some magical element with the distance. It's really those instructional design principles and adult learning principles that have been so fine-honed for these particular trainers and these training providers within that face-to-face format. And the reason they were able to, as I said, get NPS scores that high right out of the chute is because they were taking those same principles and using them, just modifying them slightly to hang on to those in the distance format. So it's not, what do you do in distance? It's take those same principles that you're using in face-to-face and just hang on to them as you transition over to distance. And that's what we found. Can it be tricky? Sure, it can be. But take, for example, they were saying, the use of small group discussion. It's something that many of them use, or almost all of them use in their training format. And they use it in face-to-face. They've been using it for years, and they've got different techniques that they use for these small group discussions, and then the larger follow-up discussions. They were just taking those breakout rooms and taking those same techniques and using the breakout rooms to do that. And the students appreciated that. And it was something that it's a design principle, and they're just taking that same principle from the face-to-face and taking it into the distance.
Great. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Was there an impact to the MPS due to class size in the distance learning experience?
Oh, that's a really good question. And most of these had a pretty consistent class size, but I don't know the answer to that. But that's an interesting that would be an interesting follow-up to look at.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going on to the next question.
Oh, I was going to say, I think with respect to when they were, and Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, with respect to most folks, when they're using the distance, they do try to keep it to manageable sizes, where just as they do with their in-person classes, they keep it in such a way that they do have a command on the classroom itself, be it virtual, be it online, or be it in person. So, I think there was pretty much consistency, but I think that's an interesting question.
And Sue, I think one of the other interesting facts that we've seen since the start of the use of distance learning is, in the beginning, instructors, like you said, wanted to keep those classes small because they were getting comfortable with
Correct.
the technology. And now, 2+ years later, anecdotally talking to trainers who are still doing distance learning, they're able to take on bigger classes because they're more comfortable. They're in the beginning, where they might have wanted breakouts to be no more than 7. Now their skills and their comfort have now said, well, I can go to 10 in a breakout, in which then if you add that cohort of instructors to teach a class, you can make those breakouts so you can make the classes a little bit bigger. But that's a really interesting question to look at, that when we timed this evaluation to know whether or not class size had an impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really where that designated technical person comes into play, because the larger you make these classes, the more variables you're going to be throwing into the mix with respect to the technology's two ways. One, the technology itself, but it's also the learner's access to the technology, and they're going to have their own set of issues. So the larger you make those class sizes, the more you really do have to have that designated technical person.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And one last question. Did you have the opportunity to conduct any pre and post training assessments regarding the impact on overall safe work practices on the job as reported by trainees?
Pre and post, you mean immediately following training and then 3 to 6 months out?
I am guessing he means
Yeah.
prior to training and after training. It's a pre-post comparisons that show improvements in safe work practices can be powerful.
Yes, and we did not do that kind of pre-post study. The focus on the 3 to 6 months out was really just on those who had taken distance learning, and the questionnaire was filled out anonymously, so we didn't have the pre-measures for them. But I to that point, I think it makes much more powerful statements if you have those pre-post measures as opposed to post only.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Well, with that, I think we will wrap up. And Dr. Sarpy and Gary, thank you so much for your time today. And just for anyone who missed it in the beginning, this was recorded. We will send a follow-up email with a YouTube link to the recording, and also a link to a PDF of the slides. And you can feel free to follow up with me by responding to any of your WebEx emails if you have questions after the event. So thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.